Morning everyone, welcome to this, the 10th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. Can I ask everyone to make sure that the mobile phones and electronic devices are switched off? I would also first of all like to welcome Kenny Gibson to the committee this morning. Kenny's here to substitute for Kevin Stewart. But since it's the first time that Kenny has been at the committee, I have to ask if you have any interest that you need to declare.
No, Convener, thank you very much for your welcome, and I have nothing to declare. I would say, however, that I have a long-standing ministerial engagement at 11 with Keith Brown, so regrettably I'll have to leave the committee somewhat early.
A short but sweet stay, I hope you find it enjoyable. We then go to our agenda, and item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. We've been asked to decide whether to take items 5 and item 6 in private. Item 5 is consideration of our work programme, and item 6 is consideration of an invitation to visit a DWP office in Scotland where decision making is carried out. Our members agreed that we take them in private. Okay. We go then to agenda item 2, and that is to take evidence from the big lottery. In that regard, I'd like to welcome Jackie Killeen, who's the Director for Scotland. Thank you very much for coming along this morning, Jackie. The big lottery has come up on a number of occasions in our deliberations, and we felt it would be useful if we could have an opportunity to have a chat with you about it. But if you've got any opening comments or a statement that you'd like to give us, we'll hear that first before we go to questions from the committee members.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you very much for inviting me along. I hope that we're able to share our experience, which maybe gives some insight into the kinds of challenges that communities are coming forward to us looking for help with addressing. I'm very happy to say a little bit by way of introduction about the Big Lottery Fund. I'm not sure how much information members have. Okay. Some of you, I think, will know us on a constituency basis. We're the largest of the lottery distributors, which means we distribute 40% of all the money raised for good causes by the National Lottery. And we are a UK-wide non-departmental public body, but with a very high degree of devolution. So we receive policy directions from Scottish ministers. And in Scotland, those are signed off by Mr. Swinney, and they underpin all of our work. Our main focus is about improvements to communities and the lives of people most in need. So many of you will be aware that most of our funding goes into projects that are either charities or community organisations working to help people really on the sharp end of challenges. Over the past 5 years, we've been working with a portfolio of both small grants, which go into grassroots organisations, and larger grants, which can be up to £1 million, which tend to tackle some bigger issues. Those include things like employment, and in particular helping people who are very disadvantaged move into employment, work around supporting families, and work around supporting communities. Specifically over the last 2 years, I suppose, we've noticed a rise in what we would describe as hardship and material need. And we've seen this come forward to us through requests for things like food banks, opportunities to give people white goods or food parcels. And we didn't have programmes that were readily made to support that kind of request. Also, as an outcomes funder, we have tried to take a more longer term approach, which is about kind of building and strengthening communities rather than being a sort of crisis funder. So we had to think about what was the best way of responding to this growing level of hardship. So we've made some alterations to our main programmes so that we can more readily respond to that. But we've also introduced a new fund called Support and Connect a few months ago. We've just closed to the first round of applications to that programme. That has £10 million, and I'm very happy to say a bit more about that through questions, if that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. I suppose in opening up questions, the main reason, or the main issue that came up when we were looking at funding was in relation to the amount of money that was made available by the Cabinet Office at the UK level for advocacy work in relation to the changes in welfare. And I think the statistics were that the UK government put about 33 million into that pot, and the big lottery matched that. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, the Big Lottery Fund put £30 million into that programme in England.
Yeah. So, as a consequence of that, the Scottish Government received around £3.5 million, which they have made available for welfare and advice. Why has the Big Lottery, or has the Big Lottery engaged in a discussion with the Scottish Government about this? And if so, why have we not seen the same result culminating here?
I suppose a couple of things to say about that. First of all, yes, in England, colleagues had been working around advice for quite some time, as we also have in Scotland. They receive policy directions from the UK government for their work in England. We receive them from the Scottish Government. We decided to develop the Support and Connect Fund because we thought that we needed something slightly different in Scotland. So what we saw from evidence and from dialogue with other funders and frontline organisations was a need not just to be able to support advice services, although those were very important as well, but to be able to try and support ways of helping people get advice from other places in their communities, and also helping ways of joining those advice services up to other places that can help people, particularly, for example, housing associations and other community-based organisations. So we sometimes do get these questions when there is a fund in England. Why do we not do exactly the same in Scotland? Partly because the context in Scotland is different, and partly because we work at different timescales. So we had already had our Investing in Communities programme up and running. The England programmes were running at a different time frame. I wouldn't want you to think that we hadn't been working with the Scottish Government. We have, and we were aware, as we were close to finalising our Support and Connect Fund, that they were also considering putting money into advice. So what we've been doing is working quite closely with the Scottish Government, with Money Advice Scotland, with the Scottish Legal Aid Board, so that we can make sure that there isn't any duplication in the funding available and that people can be passported to where is most suitable for them. I think their funding has more of a focus specifically on the advice side, and while we will pick that up, and we've seen a lot of applications that come in that are around advice, we have that broader base which is about advice more broadly and also connecting services up.
Yeah, that's helpful. But you did say that you could be driven by policy from the UK government. Is it the same relationship here? Had the Scottish Government said, OK, we like what you're doing, but we would want you to put in £3 million or reciprocate?
What I should say is that the policy directions both in England and in Scotland are set at quite a high level. The government in England had only very recently issued policy directions, so the programmes are at a different point in time in England, so they have been developing a whole new raft of programmes, whereas ours have been running for a number of years, since 2010. That's really all I meant to say by that. We weren't directed in England. I think it's because of the timing that they decided to combine those funds rather than being specifically directed to work together.
But did you have a specific discussion with the Scottish Government about whether a replication of that was appropriate here, and whether a specific discussion about topping up the £3.5 million, or was it just assumed that things would carry on as they were without any specific discussion around it?
We spoke to them while we were developing our fund, absolutely, and we've worked with them on trying to make sure that we are taking full advantage of their intelligence. They decided, because of what they wanted to focus their fund on, which is much more specifically about advice, to route it through other channels, including the Scottish Legal Aid Board. And so what we've been trying to do is make sure that we're still making the best use of all those funds available. So they didn't issue us a direction to do anything specific in Scotland, but we have kept in very close contact with them while they were doing that. They are different funds. They have a slightly different focus, if you'll.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. Alex, you want to?
Just going to carry on, almost cover some of the same ground from a slightly different angle. When you look at the headline funds, what's going on south of the border is there is match funding for the support for advice services, and that is not obviously the case in the Scottish context. So the fear is, from many, that the amount of money available to support these services is half as much per capita in Scotland as south of the border. Now, is what you are telling us that the big lottery fund is in fact putting that additional money in Scotland, but it's going in different ways?
Yes, you've expressed that probably far better than I have. That's exactly what I'm telling you. We had probably between 2010 and now put in about £3 to £4 million into advice through our main programmes anyway, but specifically through this £10 million Support and Connect fund, we would expect to put a very high level of funding into advice services. But as I say, with that slightly broader focus.
Others may be interested in digging into what exactly you're doing. I'm looking at a very specific issue here, and that is that decisions on funding relating to the support services, the advice services, is there any significant way in which that differs in Scotland that may have a different outcome from that the big lottery fund match funding in England and Wales would?
If you mean decisions taken by the big lottery fund in Scotland, we have a Scotland committee which takes our decisions on our strategic direction, but also takes funding decisions. I'm not sure if that's the thrust of your question.
My question is fairly general, and I'll ask it in a fairly general sense to try and get the impression. If we imagine a situation where the arrangement that exists south of the border was simply duplicated in Scotland, is the current circumstance likely to divert resources to specific areas that would be different from the effect of the decision south of the border?
Yes, I think we will. I think because we've just had the deadline we've just had the first lot of applications in for Support and Connect, and we can see, although we haven't been through all of those yet because we did have a very high level of applications, we can see a very large number of Citizens Advice Bureau are in there. I can't tell you specifically what they've asked us for yet, but we can also see that there are partnership applications in there. So, for example, we can see that there are a number of applications in which, although we haven't had the chance to go through them in very great detail yet, we can see they are CABs working in partnership with other organisations, community-based organisations, in some cases in contact with local authority services, in some cases working with housing associations. So we would expect to see a very large number of advice service-led projects funded through this £10 million funds, but we would also expect to see a significant number of projects which perhaps put the CAB in the driving seat of a local partnership or see the CAB as part of a local partnership, which is about joining services up.
You mentioned earlier that this might include support for advice services through housing associations. Is that the case?
Yes.
Is that another substantial part of the bidding?
Yes, we've already seen, before we even introduced this new fund, we'd already seen that kind of request come forward to us. And when we've been talking to Bureau and housing associations and local voluntary organisations throughout the country, we had seen quite a lot of appetite for that, for people to be able to sort of create a more joined up safety net, I suppose, locally, so that there were less chances of people dropping through. So recognising that sometimes people will go straight to their CAB for advice, but other times they'll seek advice elsewhere. So in some cases, the relationship with a housing association is more immediate. People in a housing association are able to spot when somebody might be in need of advice, but might not have come forward for it themselves voluntarily. So it's about trying to make sure that we have, I suppose, put in place as much local support that is connected as possible.
Again, in the general sense about headline figures here, there is a perceived gap of about £3.5 million in support that you've now explained to us where it would be filled. But you've talked about a £10 million fund. Are we talking like for like there? Is that an annual figure that we're looking at?
What our committee have decided to do in this instance, because we've already got Investing in Communities, which has already been making very large grants to organisations that do help people in need. What they've decided to do is to set up this £10 million fund, which will fund projects that run over 2 years. So that will give us an opportunity to see what's the demand for that, what are organisations able to do, while also think about what's the best approach in the longer term. Our committee is quite conscious, and so are we, of not wanting to, I suppose the expression has been used, institutionalise emergency or institutionalise crisis. So we're an outcomes funder. We try and take a long-term approach. We want to try and build resilience and build those connections so that we're not making just short-term investments. But we absolutely recognise that people are experiencing hardship and need now. So we have put this £10 million fund in place to be able to help meet that in that 2-year shorter term, while we look at what's the best approach for Scotland in the longer term here.
So we're looking at a sum of money which will have the effect of doing the same thing that's happening south of the border, but an additional sum of money that will be available to deal with additional problems.
Yes, I suppose in numerical terms, the difference between what we had already been doing and what we're additionally doing is that investing in communities, the main grants programme that we have in Scotland that had already been funding work like this, funds over 5 years. It funds up to £1 million, and it tends to focus very much on long-term work, preventative work that's about addressing the root causes of challenges. This Support and Connect Fund funds will make grants of up to £350,000 over a 2-year period, and it very much recognises that there is a higher need to meet immediate hardship and immediate challenges that people are facing, including advice, but also, for example, things around preventing homelessness, preventing children not being able to access, food. So we see a lot of demand in that. Just in that initial bunch of applications, we can see that there are applications in there which are about white goods, which are about food banks, which are about breakfast clubs, which we can see that sort of provision is very much what people in communities are looking to make available in their local areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Ms. Colleen. Could you tell me the money that is available south of the border, over what period that's available?
I just have to check my notes.
I'll wait.
If you don't mind. I think that it's a transition fund, so I think these are 3-year grants, but I would be very grateful if you would let me double check that and get back to you. I know that it had a single deadline, so applications have already been in and assessed, and as far as I know, those grants will be made in June. But I think from memory, it's 3 grants.
£65 million to cover a 3-year period.
Yeah.
Okay.
But please let me double check that.
Of course, but just going on what you've said just now, in terms of, there's references been made to the £3.5 million that's been made available to the Scottish Government for Advice Services, but of course we know that money's already been supplemented. There's been more money put in by the Scottish Government. They're putting in £5.1 million. I think there's another £2.35 million from the Money Advice Service, and they're making advice work programmes. So that's nearly £7.5 million. I think that's important to put in the record when we're referring to £3.5 million. But that leads me into my question to you, because the £10 million that you're referring to, is that over a single year period?
Got 2 deadlines, one which has just passed and one which will be in September, and those grants will run for 2 years. And as I said, we will keep that very much under review. Okay. So it may well be that our committee takes a view based on what people have asked us for, that we might need to extend that, or we might need to do something differently.
So you might supplement it with additional funds. I'm not asking you to commit to that. I'm saying that there is that possibility.
Yes, it's a possibility. We try to be responsive and take account of what's happening, which is why we introduced this fund in the first
That sounds an eminently sensible approach to me. So essentially, we're talking about £20 million.
Sorry,
worth, sorry. If you let me finish, apologies. £20 million between what's been provided with the Making Advice Work programme. I could see your concern. You thought I was saying £20 million by the Big Lottery Fund, and £10 million, making it £20 million by the Big Lottery Fund in Scotland over 2 years, and it's £65 million over 3 years in England. So essentially, on a proportionate basis, it sounds to me there's more being invested here in Scotland. on a proportionate basis?
Yeah, from a big lottery fund perspective, Scotland, we by share receive 10.35% of the overall money available across the UK. So we have probably put a bit more than what you would have expected into this.
A like-for-like basis
Yeah.
in terms of the programmes, though, not so much what you are allocated as an organisation, what you are allocating as an organisation.
Yes, what we're allocating
and what the
to-
Scottish Government is allocating. If you, as much as you can, because they're different. I appreciate that. The programme that you're taking forward is different from what has been taken forward south of the border. But as much as we can say on a like-by-like basis, there's £65 million over 3 years in England, and there's £20 million between the Scottish Government project and the Big Lottery Fund here in Scotland over 2 years. So that sounds to me as that's on a proportionate basis higher investment here in Scotland.
Yes, you could
Thank you.
say that.
Okay.
Convener, the Support and Connect Fund, is that capital and resources, or is it just resource grants that can be applied for?
It's both. But we would expect the majority of the funding to be for revenue, but we absolutely, that's one of the changes that we have made, because we recognise that there is that request for small capital items in there that we haven't seen previously in our funding.
You see small capital in terms of
Well, people have been asking us for some quite practical things, for help with quite practical things, washing machines, for example, that sort of item, which we wouldn't have expected to be seeing in applications to us in the past, and that's why we've made it possible to fund that sort of item in this.
So you don't
programme.
see in this grant form buildings, for example, being funded, for example?
The grants are up to £350,000, so I suppose the amount of capital work you can undertake with that would be probably fairly limited, and we would expect it to be primarily revenue. But again, having not had the chance to go through the first raft of applications in detail, it may be that there are greater levels of requests for capital in there.
I mean, you say in your submission that we're aware of the current levels of hardship and material need facing communities and individuals throughout Scotland, and you say our investment has so far helped local projects provide a wide range of support. We've delivered this through a range of our existing funding programmes. I'm just wondering if you can quantify that.
Yes, we spent about £75 million a year in Scotland. We put that out in new grants. It depends on sort of where you would what you would describe as projects that address most in need. So last year we invested around £70 million. Around £50 million in projects through investing in communities. So those are, like I've said, projects that are helping people with long-term challenges and issues like employment, like young people who have been in the criminal justice system, young people who've got additional needs. And I suppose what we've seen is that over time, over recent times, some of those challenges have become more difficult. So around employment, for example, it's harder for young people and other groups who have been marginalised to achieve to access a job. I'm trying to give you a sensible answer, but it's because everything we do is about need. To a large extent, it's quite hard to say, could we quantify these down? So I would say that across all of our programmes, from Awards for All right through to investing in communities, we've seen an increase in requests that are more about the shorter term, the immediate need, and while also trying to keep funding the longer term preventative work.
Okay. Now, so in your Valentine's Day letter to the convener, you said we are currently engaging with the Scottish Government to gain a detailed understanding of the recently announced funding for support advice services and to explore how our investment can be complemented to achieve greater impact. Now, you touched a little bit on this earlier on, but I'm just wondering if you can tell us where we actually are with that, because we've had some discussions about this already. But I just want to know where these discussions are and when decisions will finally be made in terms of delivering the funding that's going to be delivered effectively.
Okay, so we have worked with the Scottish Government, with the the team working on welfare reform, we've also worked with Money Advice Scotland and the Scottish Legal Aid Board, who are administering the funds that the government are putting into this area. What we've tried to do is go through their funding criteria to understand in detail what it is they're looking to fund, so that we can, as people have been calling us and getting in touch with us, to try and make sure that they are directed to the best source of funding for the thing that they're particularly looking to do. My staff have been in very regular contact with the teams at those organisations, and what we would expect to do now that we've got our first raft of applications through is to be able to share intelligence around the kinds of things that people are coming forward to, and if it is the case that people have applied to us for funding when what they are looking for would have a better fit with what the government is looking to do, then we will find a way of, we're looking at finding a way of quickly and easily passporting people through to their funds without making them go through full processes all over again. But because we're slightly ahead of their timetable, those arrangements aren't completely settled down yet. We also will take cognizance of what people have applied to us for, and also as the government's funds begin to come through, take that under consideration in advising people who then come through to us in September for the second application deadline for Support and Connect.
Okay, so just finally, Convener, you said that the arrangements have not settled down yet. When is that likely to happen?
Well, as the government's funds begin to flow through, I suppose what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are sharing intelligence with them and that we are giving consistent advice to people who are looking to apply. We know that organisations will sometimes want to make an application quickly. It might be that what they're looking to do has a better fit with what the government is funding through the Scottish Legal Aid Board or Money Advice Scotland. And we'll make sure that we're directing them accordingly.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Wanda.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I think Kenneth has asked some of the things I was interested in, but to go on a wee bit further, I'm particularly interested, Jackie, in the whole ethos of connecting services, because I think that's really important and surely achievable in a country Scotland's size. Are you confident that everyone is on the same page in relation to that?
Part of what we've seen when we have been talking to organisations across the country is that sometimes, I think this is getting better, but sometimes organisations themselves are very busy responding to the needs that people present to them and may not even themselves be aware of other services that are operating at a local level that they could have a connection with. So the kinds of things that we're hoping to see through this are better referrals, quicker referrals on, so that people operating services, for example, operating food bank at a local level, are completely up to speed on what else is available and have mechanisms in place so that if they see somebody coming in, they are able to make sure that they're able to refer that person or even bring that person to other services in the same area that could help some of the other challenges that family might be experiencing, whether that is about advice, whether that is about help with managing their debts or managing money issues, whether that is about accessing care that might help them with challenges around children or families. So we would really like to be able to see that organisations at the local level are much better connected to each other, and there's some really good examples of where that happens. But what we can see is that when people are dealing with much higher levels of demand than they've experienced before, often it can be quite difficult for them to look up and make those connections. And what we're trying to do with this funding is to make that easier for them, to put resources into the connection side of things as well as the actual supports.
Finding those at the top, those that make the decisions, are very much working together? Is there ongoing dialogue in that?
Yes, we've seen really good examples right across Scotland. I would say particularly between housing associations and Citizens Advice Bureau, where those partnerships are already in place and they're beginning to work quite well. And that's very admirable considering the challenges that those organisations are facing now. What we think is harder is for smaller, locally based organisations who are often, have very small numbers of staff and are volunteer run, for them to be able to do that. So part of what we're hoping to do with this fund is to help those locally based organisations make those connections as well.
Sometimes at an even higher level, bureaucracy can get in the way and slow things down terribly. How are you finding it in terms of government agencies, local authorities, etc.?
We've probably had more contact with local government over the last 6 months around this than we had previously. We think that we've seen a really good response from organisations like the Scottish Federation for Housing Association, who've had a real facilitating role in helping broker dialogue with some of their with their networks. I think we are seeing an increase definitely in those local groupings of partners, I suppose, community planning partners or other agencies, and a number of those have approached us, have asked us to come and talk to them about the kinds of things that we can support, and we've been out on the road doing that over the last few months.
And you feel that it's improving?
It's improving, and we've had, as I said, we've had a very high level of interest in this fund. So I'll be very happy to share with you the detail of what it is people have come forward to once we've been through that. Once we've been through that assessment, the deadline was the 13th of May. So we're working through those applications just at the minute.
You were saying it was for small capital things, but generally resource. Can I ask you, would any of that resource be used to employ more people?
Absolutely.
And what kind of checks are there on what people can be employed? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, local authorities. I know that there have been instances in the government's change fund where all that would apparently be achieved is that there's more people in jobs, but not a lot of difference in the ground. And I'm wondering if you have particular checks, balances, monitoring with this fund.
There are a few things. So lottery funding has to be additional. That's one of the absolute requirements. So we can't fund statutory obligations, for example. So things that are the responsibility of other agencies, we mustn't fund those. But added value and additionality are kind of key watchwords for us. So we would want to understand very clearly what the added benefit of a new post would be. And with a two-year fund, we would also want to be clear about thinking longer term. So are those partnerships being embedded at the local level, so that if there is a person being employed, they are thinking, those organisations are thinking in the longer term, what do they need to do beyond those 2 years? So they're beginning to throughout, as they have this resource, this capacity, what should they be doing in the longer term, both about the need that they're trying to address, but also cementing those partnerships and also the longer term requirement for those kinds of posts.
Mm-hmm. One final wee thing, Convener. It was interesting, you were talking about obligations, etc. And one of the things that jumped out at me from your submission was grants for food banks. And then you mentioned tackling food and fuel poverty. And food poverty is an expression that hasn't actually been crystallised previously that I've seen in writing from anyone. I do remember when the National Lottery was set up, there was a lot of concern about it being used to replace social services, etc. I wonder, is this request and using lottery funding to feed people. Is that fairly new?
I would say that's definitely grown in demand over the last couple of years. We've always seen requests to an extent which are about projects working in disadvantaged areas that might have had an element of, you know, after-school clubs which would provide a meal for children. But what we've seen particularly through the small grants, through Awards for All, has been an increase in often people at a very local level who see a need around them and are motivated to try and address it themselves. Quite often they're a bit unsupported and they can find that quite difficult. So those support connections locally are even more important for organisations like that. So some of this is a bit anecdotal, but you know, when my staff have been out in different areas with, for example, organisations like the Buttle Trust, they will have seen breakfast groups or organisations that are running an event in a local hall a couple of times a week, which provide meals often for children or sometimes for pensioners. So there's always been an element of it, but it's definitely increased.
So would the food bank part be new?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm kind of assuming that the fund is oversubscribed. I mean, if I'm wrong, by all means say. I'm quite interested to know if you've got any sense of how much it's oversubscribed. You said you were looking at the applications.
We've had, I think, 120 applications in for this roundabout. Now, there will be always a bit of rounding in that when we get through to the detail. I couldn't tell you yet exactly how much that will be for, but I suspect it will. What we didn't do is say we'll put £5 million in for this deadline and £5 million in for the autumn one. We wanted to be able to see what the level of demand now is. But yes, I would expect there to be a very high level in terms of monetary value coming through in this round.
So how I'm quite interested in you've expressed a number of hopes about what the fund might achieve. For example, prioritising projects which are about connecting services, and you also said there that you hope that you might be able to support small local volunteer-led projects which might find difficulty accessing other funds. So I'm quite interested then in, if the fund is oversubscribed, what the criteria are that you're going to apply and how you'll do that if you haven't actually divided the fund in two parts. I mean, how do you avoid giving it all away that's not fair, giving it all away. How do you avoid allocating all of it in the first round, and then I'm just interested in what the process is.
So we're very much focused on those two outcomes, and we're also trying to make sure that we're able to help offer this funding across as much of the country as possible, so that the two key outcomes are that people are better able to access support at the local level, and that support is more connected, so that there is a reduced risk of people falling through. And we're also very conscious that these are issues that are experienced across the country. So as I've said, and I think as I said to the convener earlier, what we would do is keep this under review. So if there is a very high level of demand, both in this at this point and in the autumn, it may well be that we would review the overall budget available for this. But we want to be able to see what is what's the quality of applications that have come through in this first round, and how able are people to respond to that need to join things up at the local level. Partly because I'm coming to you just a couple of weeks after the deadline, we haven't had a kind of qualitative assessment of that just yet. But it's, as I've said, it's possible that we may review the budgets depending on overall what that demand is.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's quite reassuring, but I'm still struggling a little bit to understand how you're going to make this judgment. I mean, don't you have to I don't know, score the applications on the basis of certain criteria and rank them on that basis?
We do, and what you would always find is that there are some applications which are much better developed than others, also some applications which might better fit one of our other programmes, where, you know, as much as we've tried to direct people to the correct source of funding, they have come in to support and connect when they may well have been better off to come into Awards for All or investing in communities. So what we are able to do internally is passport people along to the more appropriate source. And there will be some applications which won't be successful. But I suppose if we're trying to focus on these outcomes and trying to fund as many of those as possible will be our aim to support as much of this work, if it's fundable, across the country as possible.
Is it fair to say then that you actually think it's quite likely you might have to increase these funds in order to meet the need?
That would have to be a decision for our committee, and it would have to be based on the evidence of what this first round of funding brings up to us. And also, I suppose it's very much, we would also want to take account of what then happens as the government's funding begins to come on stream. So it is a slightly moving terrain in that respect. So there are developments that may encourage organisations to they might have applied to us in now, who may who may then decide that that's all they have the capacity to do. So they might not have ever, wanted to come back to us in a second round. We don't know yet how much of the demand or how much of the need we will be able to absorb in this first round of funding.
Good morning. I had a question looking at the issue from the perspective of the fact that this is a reserved matter to Westminster dealt with by the DWP, and I just wonder what role has the DWP played in these discussions, both south of the border and north of the border, because of course, it begs the question, if money's being made available for other things, which is all good and well, what residual things is it that the DWP will be doing?
With England, the arrangement was with the Cabinet Office, which is where we report in a policy direction sense in England. And the Advice Transition Fund was very much built on previous funding for advice that had come both through the Big Lottery Fund and the Cabinet Office and its predecessors in England. So it's very much focused on, in England, it's very much focused on how will advice be offered and provided now and in the future, and how will that be resourced, rather than with the DWP per se, although obviously all of those bureau are conscious of and working with the sort of local DWP infrastructure. In Scotland, I would have to say that our discussions have primarily been with the Scottish Government and local government, and it's at the local level where we've been taking account, for example, where we can, of the various pilots that have been underway, and we've been able to look a bit at the experience of housing associations, for example, in informing this. Would we have had very much direct engagement with the DWP? I would have to say it's been less than we would have had with the Scottish Government, who've been our primary engagement on this in developing it.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting. But in general terms, presumably, in order to determine how to best spend, hard-pressed resources, one has to determine what the gap is, and to determine what the gap is, one needs to know what the organisation in charge is going to do and what it isn't going to do in terms of, as you put it, the local DWP infrastructure. And I just wonder, what picture is being formed of what the gap is. What are, for example, we've heard a lot of evidence about the difficulties that many people will face for one reason or another with respect to online applications. And taking that simply as one example, do we know what the DWP is planning to do through its local infrastructure on that issue? or not, such that we can determine what else needs to be done to help people have access to the information they need to make the application. Is that something that comes within your considerations?
Probably not so much, although we have seen, and again, I don't know whether people have applied to us for this, but we have been aware of discussions happening at the local level on how digital exclusion can best be addressed in relation to this. So we've seen some good examples of local library networks, for example, thinking about how they can make their both their services and their staff available to help people with that online move. Housing associations, again, we know are very conscious of this. For us, it's about trying to make sure that people who are facing challenges, and there will be a range of those challenges, hardship, also the changes coming through with welfare reform, but also challenges that they may experience personally, like lack of access to either IT or confidence in using those. So, yeah, we are keen to be able to work with local organisations, and if there is a strong partnership that includes all of those elements at the local level, we'd want to be able to be sure that we're putting support in the right places that is additional.
Thank you for that. I mean, obviously, it might be an issue to pursue, another issue to pursue with the DWP convener. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. I mean, that seems to have exhausted our questions. Clearly, there's a picture emerging, Jackie, and it may be that in the fullness of time we may have to have a discussion again once the mist is cleared a bit, if you like. So, thanks very much. Unless there's anything you want to say in conclusion?
No, I'm just sorry that I'm coming to you so soon after our deadline and I'm not able to give you that more granular information. I'd be very happy to write to you or to come back and let you have that.
And at some point we might be able to look at the clearer picture and assess it at that point. But thanks very much for giving us your time this morning. It was really helpful, I think, in clarifying some of the issues around this.
It's a pleasure. I would just finally say that we'll obviously keep this under review, and our aim is to be as responsive but also responsible as we can be in Scotland with issues like this. And if as the picture, as we see that picture of need clarifying, we may well develop further interventions or further approaches that address that. But it is, as you'll appreciate, a bit of a moving picture at the minute.
Totally appreciate that, Jackie. Thanks very much for your time this morning. Thank you. Okay, I'll suspend for a couple of minutes to change witnesses. Our next item of business this morning is to take evidence from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and here to represent the Scottish Human Rights Commission is their chair, Alan Miller. I think, Alan, you want to make some opening remarks and then we'll open it up to the committee members to ask questions, but thanks very much for coming along this morning. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Convener, and to all of you, and can I commend you all on the work that you have been doing. I think it might assist if I just very, very briefly maybe set the scene in three ways for then further discussion. What does human rights bring to your table? What does it add to the work that you're doing on this area? Where are we in terms of the situation that we've now reached? And what can be done in the circumstances. So in terms of what does human rights bring to the table, that I think would add a necessary dimension to your consideration of this. International human rights law provides for the right to social security as part of the right to an adequate standard of living. And I think just that very language is useful to broaden the terms of the debate, which hitherto has been on welfare reform, and with a lot of stigmatisation attached to a UK debate on welfare reform. I think it's very helpful and will lead to better scrutiny of the welfare reform measures if they're seen in the broader international human rights legal framework of the right to social security. The framework provided by international human rights law is not also just putting out big rights and not filling in very much of the detail as to what they might mean and what states are supposed to do. And they provide a framework also in which, in times of austerity, how decisions and policies should be made that will have an impact on the right to social security. So some of these principles would be very, very helpful if they had been followed before now, but should still be followed now. And that is that all member states, which includes the United Kingdom, which has accepted all of these international human rights treaties, accept that they should progressively realise the right to social security and an adequate standard of living through the maximum available of resources being committed to realising that right. That where in times of austerity there may well have to be cuts in public spending, that those cuts, as they impact on the right to social security, should be demonstrated to be necessary. That is, there should be evidence given as to what alternatives were considered and why they were rejected, and on what evidence the legal measures brought forward are based, and what likely impact is understood by those bringing forward the measures. The measures should be temporary and they shouldn't be sort of built into the system on any other basis. And they should prioritise the most vulnerable and not create unjustifiable discrimination against those most vulnerable. And even in times of austerity, they must ensure that there is a core essential for human dignity, for a human dignified existence, and that the right to social security can't be so impacted that it leaves people in a state of destitute. The second point as to where are we? Well, because the United Kingdom has refused, despite continual requests from the United Nations, and unlike many other countries, has refused to incorporate those international human rights treaties which it has ratified, but has refused to give them status, legal status within the UK. It means that it's been left to the UK Parliament to pass legislation not within that international human rights legal framework. The consequence of that today is that no human rights impact assessment whatsoever was done by the UK government before it brought forward these legislative measures. A box was ticked to say no impact on human rights. When the UK Parliament Joint Committee asked what reference was made to the international human rights legal obligations that the UK had, it said that they didn't consider there were any implications, and so no detailed analysis was done. Literally a one-sentence reply. But more than that, it means that the public is left with very inadequate legal protection. That whilst the UK has signed up to these international human rights treaties and has the legal obligation to apply them domestically, the public has no rights to enforce them in tribunals or courts within the UK. So it leaves the public largely unprotected from measures such as this. And then finally, what can be done? Well, I think what is already being done is that individuals will use whatever legal means they can to challenge the impact of some of those measures on their right to social security. They will use the Human Rights Act, which will provide some form of protection. It doesn't give the right to social security, but it does give certain other protections for your private family life and home and non-discrimination. And we're already seeing challenges being brought to court, some successful, in particular in relation to the bedroom tax. I think local authorities in Scotland will do the best that they can, but in very, very difficult circumstances. They are left to implement a discretionary housing payment fund in relation to the bedroom tax. They should use a human rights approach using these broader principles to determine how they use that discretionary fund, but it's inadequate in terms of meeting the needs and the rights of the population. In terms of DWP, I think there should be an urgent review of some of these measures, which are already beginning to demonstrate that they haven't been properly considered, and evidence should be looked at and a review carried out to see what steps should be taken as an alternative to, particularly to the bedroom tax, which is now in force. And finally, the bigger sort of lesson from all of this, I think, for the UK and for Scotland, is to incorporate the international human rights legal treaties. It leads to better governance, better policies. It enables Parliament to hold more to account government, to exercise more scrutiny, and it gives the public protection. So going forward, either at a UK level or at a Scottish level, then incorporation of these international treaties, which provide the right to social security, adequate standard of living, adequate housing, etc. That has to be the next step that's taken. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Alan. I'll open it up to questions. I'll look at Jamie first if you want to come in.
Thank you very much, Convener, and it's good to have Professor Miller with us today. Alan, in your paper, you set out that the chairperson of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has advised all states parties that they should avoid at all times taking decisions which might lead to the denial or infringement of economic, social and cultural rights. How's the UK faring by that barometer?
Well, I don't think it is. As I said in the, my opening remarks, the UK has said in one sentence that it doesn't think there are any relevance of international human rights treaty obligations in terms of the Welfare Reform Act. Now, I don't know all those who have given evidence to you, but I think quite a lot of bodies have given you evidence which would indicate, on whatever view you take of what weight to be attached or all of that, whether it's premature to understand the impact, but clearly there are implications for the right to enjoyment of private and family life, home, and for that statement to be made, I think, doesn't serve governance, policy making or the public well at all.
You know, did the UK government respond to the call by the chairperson of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights? Do you know if they responded at all?
Well, the UK was subject to UN scrutiny earlier or late last year, and its response by and large was it was continuing to refuse to incorporate international human rights treaty obligations on the basis they felt that this was best left to the UK Parliament through domestic legislation. Now, that's a stateable position, and it's up to the United Kingdom to do that. But then it does sort of increase the necessity for that Parliament then to be able to hold to account the government when it does introduce laws and be able to satisfy itself that these laws do actually implement international human rights treaty obligations and don't breach them. Otherwise, the UK's position internationally becomes unsustainable if the Parliament is not actually able to hold the government to account and no human rights impact assessment is done, etc., that enables the Parliament to know whether these measures are consistent with international law or not.
You also talk, looking at this area of economic, social and cultural rights a bit more in your paper. You suggest that, looking abroad, Germany and Latvia provide good examples of where states have integrated such rights into their domestic or constitutional law. And you give the example that in Latvia, pensioners were able to essentially take an issue about the reduction in state pensions to their constitutional court. I mean, what are the parameters that the legislatures and the executives of these two states, and perhaps others, maybe have other examples, are operating to that doesn't exist in the United Kingdom?
Well, there's around 60 countries in the world that have sort of constitutionalised their international human rights obligations, and Germany and Latvia, these cases are just examples. What it means is that when laws are brought to a parliament, the government should be able to satisfy the parliament that these laws are consistent with its international obligations, which were entered into for the benefit of the public, because the experience of humanity and of other countries is that basic human rights must be part of the governance of every country. It's left to countries to decide how they are going to best achieve that, but everyone has agreed that's the destination. And if you don't have that framework in your constitutional framework, then it means that if you have a government of the day that seeks not to comply with international human rights legal obligations, Parliament is not able to hold it to account properly, nor are the public able to enforce their rights through the tribunals and courts within their own country.
Looking at the issue of welfare reform more widely, you set out, and as we know, that under the Scotland Act 1998, this Parliament may not pass laws which are incompatible with the Human Rights Act, also in 1998, and you go on to say, under the Scotland Act, both the Scottish Government and Parliament must also take into account the whole range of international human rights obligations by observing and implementing them. Now, this is somewhat theoretical. If we put to one side the reservation that's in Schedule 5 about this Parliament not having control over social security, say it did have control over social security, and there was an attempt to take forward these welfare reforms through this Parliament under the provisions set out in terms of the Human Rights Act and this Parliament's responsibility to refer to international human rights obligations, what would you, as the chairperson of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, what would you be saying about this Parliament in an attempt to take forward these welfare reforms through this Parliament if we had the responsibility for them?
I don't think this Parliament would do that. I don't think it would be able to do it, nor would I expect there would be a political will to do it. We've just currently finished a mapping of where human rights are in Scotland, and one of the findings from it was, in terms of the lawmaking process in Scotland, because of the Human Rights Act and Scotland Act, which create a sort of constitution in a sense and constitutionalise certain human rights, that the lawmaking by and large attracts green light in Scotland. By and large it has been consistent with the European Convention on Human Rights. It gets weaker when you get to the outcomes. The good intentions are not always turned into good practice. But you can see the benefit of devolution to date, that because of the Human Rights Act and the Scotland Act, the legislative process in Scotland is sounder, is better, and more resonates with international best practice. And indeed, some of the laws coming out of the Scottish Parliament have been recognised internationally as best practice. So we've already seen, the public benefit of constitutionalising some of our internationally recognised human rights in Scotland. What we need to do is go further and constitutionalise economic, social and cultural rights, as should the UK. And that's been a repeated call of the United Nations for decades.
That's an interesting answer. You think essentially because of our institutional practice, maybe even our cultural practice through the process of devolution, you don't think this process would even get off the ground here?
Certain aspects of it certainly wouldn't go off the ground, you know.
Annabelle.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor Miller. I've been interested to sort of follow, in general terms, the progress, or sadly otherwise, of cases brought to try to challenge some of these provisions. And I seem to recall, but I may be recalling incorrectly, that during the passage of the Welfare Reform Act, there was some attempt which came to naught. But in any event, I just wonder now, what your view would be of, leaving even the international treaty provisions to one side, which, for the reasons you've stated, it's not always easy to invoke. But in terms of the 2010 UK Equality Act, I mean, presumably there might be grounds there, and that might be an easier route for various groups or whoever to try to challenge some of this legislation. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
I think the challenges that have begun to come forward will be based on the Equality Act, and particularly discrimination against disabled, and the lack of a proper impact assessment being done, and on the Human Rights Act in terms of what's called the right to a possession, i.e. a social security entitlement, and that it's being interfered with in a discriminatory way. Again, for example, the impact on the disabled, but also under the European Convention, the right to private and family life and home. And here the bedroom tax is clearly sort of on the radar in terms of challenges under Article 8, the right to private family life and home. And the argument would be that in given cases, this will be a disproportionate interference, that the potential savings and stated public purpose will not outweigh the impact on an individual or family in terms of their having to look for alternative accommodation and uproot themselves, their family, from the life that they have led. So those are the areas that the challenges will lie in. More restricted than the broader international human rights, but more effective because we actually have given legal protection to them within the UK.
Thank you for that. And are you aware of any further challenges in the pipeline to other aspects of the Welfare Reform Act and its statutory instruments and its...
No, these seem to be the area where the challenges are currently underway, the bedroom tax, both from the equality angle and from the right to private life and the right to social security as a possession that should not be interfered with disproportionately.
But I imagine that we can envisage that as the welfare reforms are rolled out, and we see PIP rolled out in particular, that we may see further challenges down the line.
I think these potential challenges would be that there is protection under the European Convention not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment. Now, if in the worst cases we see individuals as a result of the cumulative impact of different cuts being left in a state of destitute, then Article 3 challenges will also be brought in, that the state has failed to take measures to protect someone from falling into that state of destitute. That has to be quite a high threshold, but there has been case law at the European Court where failure to take steps to protect someone and not have adequate food, clothing, housing can take you into that threshold, which for a country like the UK is intolerable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor.
You've kind of answered this, I think, Professor Miller, but I just wanted to kind of make it really clear. You're the chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. So are you saying to us that, in your opinion, the welfare reform measures that we're considering, at least in part, are not compliant in the way they were introduced with the government's human rights obligations, and that, in part, they are likely to breach the human rights of some of those affected?
Yes.
Okay. There's a paragraph in the submission about the position in Scotland, which Jamie quoted, some of which points out, as we know, that the Human Rights Act has been embedded in the Scotland Act, and you've talked a bit about that. That paragraph later on says, under the Human Rights Act, public authorities too are prohibited from acting in a manner incompatible with the rights of the European Convention on Human Rights, which are included in the HRA. And you made some reference to the position of local authorities in Scotland, who are, of course, public bodies. So my question is, because the Human Rights Act is embedded constitutionally in Scotland, does that place Scottish local authorities in a more difficult position in the sense that by implementing legislation which has come from the United Kingdom government, that they may well find themselves actually breaching ECHR and open to legal challenge then?
It puts them in a very, very difficult position. They do have a defence under the Human Rights Act that if they have no alternative other than to do what they have to do because of primary Westminster legislation, then that is a defence. And I've no doubt that they will look to rely on that defence. The case law to date from the Court of Appeal in England would seem to indicate that if a local authority is being challenged on the basis that the discretionary fund that it has from the DWP is not being allocated in a way that someone then challenges and said, I should have had, some discretionary payment. It may well be that the courts will take the view that that discretionary payment fund is insufficient to satisfy the requirements of the Human Rights Act, and that therefore the local authority should not be legally liable. What the courts have said to date, when the DWP argued, look, there might be cases where there's real hardship and there is a discretionary housing payment for those exceptional cases. What the court has said, that's not good enough because, one, it's discretionary, i.e. It might be here this year, gone next year. There's a capped fund to it. Therefore, it's unlikely to capture all the deserving cases. The National Audit Office at a UK level has said the same thing. Where's the evidence base for the £30 million, which is considered to be sufficient? So the courts seem to be taking the view that this discretionary housing payment fund is inadequate to meet the requirements of the Human Rights Act, and therefore the legal challenge of an individual in Scotland would primarily be against the DWP.
Right. Okay. Well, further on in the paper, you talk about the right to respect for private and family life, home and correspondence, Article 8, I think that is, and you point out that it's consistently been found that the loss of one's home is the most extreme form of interference with the right for respect for the home. And quite a lot of discussion in this committee and elsewhere around how local authorities deal with this is around their willingness or capacity to avoid evicting their own tenants if they get into rent arrears as a result of the bedroom tax. So a similar version of the same question then. I mean, are we saying then that if they were to find themselves in a position where they felt they had no option but to evict a tenant, again, would they be potentially found in breach of Article 8 then by removing that person's home?
Yes, no, it's a very, very tough place for local authorities to find themselves in. They would have to demonstrate that eviction was the last resort open to them, and the courts would have to be satisfied that all other avenues had been explored before that step was taken. That's existing law, which relates to rent arrears in general, and it would also relate to bedroom tax arrears being part of those rent arrears.
Would that apply to other RSLs like housing associations as well?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Professor Miller, you'll have noted and heard that a new phrase seems to have entered currency, which is food poverty. And you'll also have heard this morning that we're in the position where we're now feeding people off the National Lottery. So I would just ask you to give us an outline of where that stands in relation to human rights, the lack of dignity in queuing at a food bank, the inability to perhaps feed your children.
I was listening like you to Jackie Colleen, and it really was quite an insight. And as I was sitting there, I was reminding myself that when Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, she said in a sort of famous quote, where do human rights begin? It's not in far-off countries that you can only see on maps of the world. They begin in places close to home, in our neighbourhoods, communities, care homes, workplaces. And I have to say that, I've been chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission for 5 years now. And Scotland, compared with many other countries in the world, has a relatively good human rights record and situation. But this issue, and I hope I'm proven wrong, but this issue of the bedroom tax, I think, has the potential to become one of the most compelling human rights issues in Scotland, and really is not something that we should be sitting around the table having to talk about in this day and age.
Yeah. What about the issue of food?
Well, I think that indicates that Article 3, which is the protection against inhuman and degrading treatment, by and large is used by the European Court of Human Rights in very, very bad situations of detention in prisons, police stations, etc. But we are moving in the direction where it is foreseeable that there will be cases that could find their way from the UK to the European Court of Human Rights, where someone who's on the street as a result of the cumulative impact of cuts to social security could well be arguing, and perhaps successfully, that they have been left in such a state that it amounts to inhuman and degrading treatment. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's intolerable in a country such as the United Kingdom and Scotland.
Thank you.
Alan, I wonder if you could clarify a couple of things for myself. This is a specific one that was brought to my attention. The Department of Work and Pensions has enacted the Job Seekers Act 2013, and the bill states that it's been introduced to avoid the need to repay claimants who have been sanctioned for failure to comply with requirements under ESA regulations. That would give the government power to overturn a court ruling using primary legislation. Is that legal?
Well, I think you're all becoming much more expert than I am in some of the practicalities of all of this. I think one of the consequences of that power that's given to decision makers in the DWP on the question of sanctions, again, could lead to cases where someone who is genuinely unable to work but who has been classified as being unwilling to work and therefore cut off social security, if they then end up in a state of destitute, then it is quite possible that they will be able to successfully claim that they have been subjected to inhuman and degrading treatment. There is appears to be such a wide discretion given to these decision makers in DWP that one hopes that these cases never happen, but it's a definite risk.
Yeah. You also mentioned about the lack of the impact assessment, which I think everyone was aware of. Because of the absence of that, are you aware of any human rights organisation or any other organisation for that matter who might be conducting their own equality and human rights assessment, impact assessment, because of the absence of the government's own?
I think that's, in one form or another, that will be what will be attempted to be done with whatever resources are available by NGOs, or if academics can get funding to do it, I'm sure they would. But it's going to be very difficult for anybody other than a government to have the resources and the data and the reach to be able to do a robust, proper human rights impact assessment. So I'm sure there'll be all kinds of attempts to do so, and references, and many of them will be very credible. But to get a comprehensive human rights impact assessment, it's something that the state needs to do, should do, and so far has failed to do.
Was there a specific challenge to the UK government for not conducting an equality statement?
Yeah, the Joint Committee on Human Rights at Westminster did so and asked why it was not done. And as I said, there was a one-line answer. It wasn't thought that there was sufficient cause to do so.
Annabelle.
Just
Up on that, but from looking at a slightly different issue, but looking at that issue from a broader perspective, and going back to the bedroom tax and the issue of taking in of a lodger as a response to how to then mitigate the effect. And I just wonder, I mean, apart from the really fairly horrific social connotations of a state direction to that effect, I just wonder from a legal perspective, now that we have the learned professor here, where we had the DWP here the other week telling us that this would be one solution, what kind of legal issues would arise in terms of a state prescription to take in a lodger to reduce the negative effect of a social security legislative provision?
Well, legally, it'd probably be there's no requirement. You know, you do not have to take a lodger. It's one of the options that are presented to you. You charge more to members of your family, you get more hours at work, you take in a lodger, you move. So legally, it's probably not going to be contentious. But, you know, the law is one thing, and that's the backstop. And if individuals have to take cases to court, then they have to do that. It means the system has failed, in my view, if that's what happens. But there's also the element of just human empathy that, you know, even if the worst doesn't come to the worst for, you know, Mrs. Smith in Bells Hill, she's going to not know what's going to be happening, what the consequences are going to be this year, next year, the year after. So it's the anxiety, it's the uncertainty, it's the feeling of insecurity, as well as, you know, the legal challenges that can take place. But they'll be much narrower, they'll be much more restricted, and some will win and some will not win. But, you know, we shouldn't be in this place. People shouldn't be placed in this state of uncertainty, and it shouldn't be the onus on them to try and contrive a legal argument with the inadequate human rights framework that we have at a UK level to try and get some kind of assurance that they can live a life with some dignity to it.
Yes, I remember back in '99 when the Parliament first started, there was a general, I would say, pride across the Parliament that we had incorporated ECHR. And there was also a great pride when we appointed the Human Rights Commissioner. And I know that, Professor, you've recently been reappointed as chair of an international grouping of human rights organisations. I just wondered in terms of austerity measures that have been taken in a lot of different countries just now, and you obviously have experience of that on the committee and position as chair. I'm trying not to be subjective here, but it must be quite depressing for you to see our own human rights through the UK dropping quite considerably, I would imagine.
It is very interesting. I mean, the Scottish Commission, was re-elected unanimously as chair of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. There are 40 around the continent of Europe. And you can see emerging different responses to austerity in different parts of Europe, with different outcomes from other parts. You have the imposition of austerity measures in countries like Ireland, Spain, Greece, which are having devastating impacts on the fabric of life, leading to all kinds of social tensions, increase in suicide rates, HIV, mental health problems. You have different responses taken by countries in Northern Europe, where there has been a much more balanced way of responding to austerity, and some have made their decisions in accordance with this international human rights law framework, which gives a sort of fairer prioritisation of limited resources than the more stark austerity cuts imposed on the likes of Greece and Spain. And it does look as if the UK actually voluntarily is going down the road of imposing cuts in the context of austerity, and leading potentially to outcomes that we're seeing in other southern European countries, but not to the same extent in other northern European countries, which are responding in different ways. For example, still investing in promoting access to employment and training and mitigating some of the effects. And the economic outcomes are better, the health outcomes are better, the inequality outcomes are better. So yes, from that point of view, it's unnecessarily the UK seems to be going in the wrong direction.
Alex.
Thank you very much. Professor Miller, in his introductory remarks, talked about the duty that human rights legislation places upon government to prioritise the most vulnerable. Is that your interpretation of it?
Yes.
What I wanted to do is ask you where the principle of universality sits within that, and are we looking at a circumstance where universality could conceivably be a casualty of the prioritisation of the most vulnerable?
No, what international human rights law requires of states is that they recognise the right to social security, and that it's left then considerable leeway to determine how it's going to progressively realise that right. That can mean universality, if that's the system that it wants to promote, or it can mean means-tested criteria. But generally, whatever system is adopted should not be discriminating on unjustifying grounds against particular sections of the population, children, women, disabled, migrants, whatever, and it should prioritise those who are most vulnerable and the least resilient.
The principle of universality, as we discuss it in the UK context, tends to be about limiting the entitlement to certain benefits to those who are in higher income brackets. Would it be fair to say then that the human rights legislation is silent on that particular area?
As to whether it should be universal or means tested? Yes, it's as long as there are red lines that human rights puts down. As you know, as a result of whatever system is adopted, no one should fall below inhuman and degrading treatment. There are amber lights that say if you're going to interfere, say through means testing, with an individual's quality of life, then you should make sure it's not a disproportionate interference.
So it would be on the basis of outcomes rather than the principles.
Yes.
Thank you. There's a couple of other issues I wanted to raise that have come up in discussion to some extent already, and one is the judgment, which is, if it hasn't established case law already, it's in the process of doing so in relation to those who were asked to work as part of the arrangements. I understand where we are in terms of the ruling, but is it in your view that the case that human rights legislation states that it is inappropriate for a government to ask people to work in return for any part of their benefits?
Well, this case may find its way. I don't know whether it is progressing to the European Court of Human Rights or not. Generally speaking, it's similar to the previous question you had about universality. There is no sort of blanket prohibition against what might be called conditionality of employment, unemployment benefit. But it would very much depend on the outcome and the detail and the process that was put in place. But as a principle, I suppose what I would say is that it's silent in the same way it's silent on universality.
It would therefore be reasonable to suggest that it might be conceivable that legislation could be put in place that would be consistent with human rights legislation, which would allow us to, in certain circumstances, ask individuals to participate in work experience, for example, as a condition of unemployment benefit.
Well, I think, if this case goes to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, then hopefully that judgment will answer your question, because the European Convention is what's called a living instrument. It's constantly evolving as society's expectations and values evolve. So it's very dangerous to say a categorical yes or no answer to a question like that. So far, in principle, conditionality does not breach the European Convention on Human Rights, but it is, as I say, a living instrument, and it depends very much on the case that comes before the European Court. So, if this case is going to go there, let's wait and see what the judgment is.
Another issue which I wanted to tackle, which is an extension of something that's been discussed already. We've heard in a great deal of evidence that we've taken in this committee about the establishment of food banks in Scotland. And it is indeed disappointing, to say the least, that it has become necessary for food banks to exist. However, they have existed since before the welfare reform process was put in train, and there is a reasonable degree of concern that in many cases one of the causes of need for the food banks is the fact that many people who are in receipt of benefits find it very difficult to budget, very difficult to prioritise their expenditure. If we were to consider the possibilities of dealing with that particular problem, can you imagine a circumstance where it would be appropriate for the UK government or any subsequent government to use the medium of, for want of a better word, food stamps as an alternative to simply giving people the money to dispose of as they see fit?
I think this takes me back to the original point I was making about the stigmatisation that's taking place very unhelpfully of many sections of our community. And this this description of people who are living from day to day trying to make ends meet, and the government introducing welfare reform to assist these people with their budgetary decision-making processes, I think, is unrealistic in terms of if this is a real concern, then there should be support provided, capacity building, not sticks and carrots like this. And secondly, in terms of the reason we have austerity, it's because of the financial mismanagement of those running our financial institutions in our country, not those who are trying to find a way of getting to the end of the month on a paycheck or on Social Security. So in terms of sort of the evidence as to why we're in this place that we are and what steps have to be taken, it is a bit rich for those in the government to be blaming the mismanagement of finances by families as opposed to who got us into this hole and who should be getting us out of it.
So can you imagine any circumstance where it may be anybody's responsibility other than the benefit claimant to prioritise how their support is used?
I don't know, what you're referring to in particular, but I, for example, before I became chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, I ran a legal aid practice in Castlemilk for 15 years. There was a lot of unemployment in Castlemilk, and I'm not singling out Castlemilk. My experience was the overwhelming majority of people wanted a decent job, and when I saw young kids get a decent job, I was losing my practice. They weren't committing crimes anymore. They weren't in difficulties. They weren't, in debt or facing evictions and all that. Just getting a job stabilised their life, and the whole community benefited as a result of that, not least their families and their partners and all of that. So this stigmatisation of those who aren't in work is the most unhelpful thing in then trying to, look at legitimate areas. Now, how do we improve, reform the social security system? These are all legitimate questions, particularly in times of austerity, no matter who got us into this mess. We do have to get out of it. But we really have to move away, and that's why I was saying at the beginning, let's call this social security. Universal Declaration of Human Rights said people, either through sickness, age, becoming unemployed, or family circumstances, if they live in a civilised society, they have the right to expect some form of protection. And we all share that if we're a civilised community. But welfare reform has attached this stigma to it that then can be the political justification for all kinds of things that just go against human dignity and go against the reality of life in the UK.
Thank you.
I'll just get one final question, Alan. It's, it wasn't a Mrs. Smith from Belsill that I was talking to at the weekend. It was a gentleman, in fact. But it's almost related to the question that Ian asked. It just reminded me of the conversation that I'd had. And it was about, what powers local authorities have under this regime to protect people. Would it be possible for a local authority to say, we're not going to just follow orders, we want to actually challenge the government's legislation, because we believe that to enact it, just to follow orders, we would end up breaching someone's human rights, therefore not prepared to do it. Would they be in a position to challenge on those grounds?
As a public authority, they couldn't challenge under the Human Rights Act. They would have to be individuals who are impacted by the cuts, not the local authority, because they're not a victim in that sense of the cuts. It's individuals who are the legal victim. So they would not be able to. Also, I think I'm no doubt you've taken evidence, or will do, from local authorities, but they themselves are going to be audited by DWP as to how they implement this discretionary housing repayment fund, for example. So, they have to be very careful. My advice to them is, you should follow your duties under the Human Rights Act and prioritise the most vulnerable, and do not discriminate in how you exercise this discretionary fund. And that, if they do that, that will be an answer to DWP if they carry out an audit and say, well, we don't know why you gave funding to this category and not that category. But it is going to have to be individuals, who experience the hardships as a result of these cuts, who then bring the challenges to the DWP, saying, this is a disproportionate interference with my right to family life, etc. So Scottish local authorities are placed in a very, very difficult position.
I think they've tried to make that clear too, as it was just when I was discussing it with someone at the weekend, they thought whether the local authorities themselves might be able to offer more protection than they currently do. So that's really helpful in clarifying that. As has all of your evidence this morning, I think it's been very useful. And obviously, as with Jackie Killeen earlier, we'll watch and see how the picture emerges, and it may be we could have a chat with you again at another point to see just how the legislation is progressing and whatever challenges are coming forward. But thanks very much this morning for the evidence that you've given.
Thanks to you.
I'll suspend again for a couple of minutes. Next item of business this morning is consideration of the Welfare Reform Consequential Amendment Scotland No. 3 Regulations 2013, SSI 2013/142. The instrument was considered by the Subordinate Legislation Committee at its meeting on the 21st of May and no points were raised by that committee. We were joined by officials from the Scottish Government this morning, I think, and McVeigh was going to make a comment or two before we open up to questions. Is that all right, Anne?
Yes, that's perfectly fine. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for inviting us along this morning to talk about the latest set of welfare reform regulations. As the Deputy First Minister outlined in our letter of the 20th of April, these regulations make a number of further minor changes relating to the introduction by the UK Government of personal independence payments, commonly referred to as PIP. More substantially, these regulations make provision for recipients of the new Armed Force Independence Payments, AFIP, which is being introduced by the Ministry of Defence, to access the same benefits, disregards and allowances of recipients of either the existing Disability Living Allowance or the new PIP. AFIP is designed to provide financial support to service personnel and veterans seriously injured as a result of service, to cover the extra costs that they may have as a result of their injuries. AFIP is a substitute for Disability Living Allowance or PIP. The financial value will be the same as for the higher rate components of PIP. The main difference is that the recipients of AFIP will not have to undergo the periodic reassessments as those in relation to people in receipt of PIP will have to do going forward. AFIP, it's a Ministry of Defence benefit that's being administered by the Department of Work and Pensions. It's not something that falls within the ambit of the Scottish Government. And the Ministry of Defence, they estimate that there will be around 5 potential recipients of APIP in Scotland each year, and there may be about 50 people who might be eligible from the outset. So it's very, very, very small numbers of people that are will be affected by this change. At the same time, these regulations make a change to the National Health Service travelling expenses and remission of charges regulations, commonly referred to as the TERC regs. And these changes are to make sure that any dependents of universal credit recipients are not required to pay any health charges, and that's during the Pathfinder period for universal credit that has now started in the Manchester area of England. And last but not least, these regulations amend the legal advice and assistance and civil legal aid instruments to make sure that any payments made from the new Scottish Welfare Fund are disregarded from the calculation of disposable income and disposable capital, as well as from any payments that are due to be recovered from solicitors. So we've just rolled up that disregard into this set of regulations for the new welfare fund that was introduced in Scotland from the beginning of April. So that's what these regulations do. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that's been quite helpful in clarifying things. Do members have any questions that they would like to ask? I wasn't given any indication, so it would appear that we don't have any questions on this. So can I then invite members to agree to note the regulations? Yes. That's agreed. Okay. Thanks very much for your time this morning. And that completes our public part of our meeting this morning. We move into private session. Thanks.